Hey everyone, this is Kevin Choate, and I am so excited for week 4 of Going Viral Christianity in Quarantine. And today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite verses in Romans 10:13. And the reason why I love it is because it is the gospel in its simplest form. And for many of us, the gospel, we think it's really great. We think it's awesome. We think it's the point of all that we do, maybe. But sometimes we don't even consider the ramifications of the gospel. And for us, we're going to be talking about those today, but I want you to first consider what your life was just 1 month ago. Consider all the things that you were doing, maybe the dance recitals, maybe the sports, maybe the tournaments, debate tournaments, or academic tournaments, or maybe you were focused on a test, or maybe you were excited to come to some concert or event. And our tendency as people is to fill our life to capacity. And what I mean by that is to imagine your life or your time as a bucket. And you've got all this space in your bucket. And slowly but surely you start pouring things in, like sports or school or church or even good things like that. And for us, what it does is it doesn't allow for anything else. It doesn't allow room for maybe reflection. Maybe it doesn't allow for you to think about what is going on in your life or how you're feeling or the things that maybe are bigger than you. Okay? And what I mean by that is sometimes we don't realize how messed up we are or how broken we are until we have time to think about it. And all of us over the last 3 or 4 weeks have had a lot of time. We've had a lot of time to think about the struggles that we've had, the ways in which we fall short, the things that upset us. We all realize maybe we're a lot more broken than we thought. Now the gospel, thankfully, helps us in our brokenness. Because in our brokenness, we tend to have this desire to fill these holes that we feel. Even with good things, but sometimes with bad things. And this brokenness is this battle to restore something that used to be there, which was a proper relationship with God. Everything was perfect in the presence of God. Everything was holy and awesome. But because of sin, or because of disobeying God, some of that was challenged. Okay? And so today we're going to be opening up Romans 10:13. And what's going on in this chapter is Paul is really trying to dissect the message of salvation to all. The message of salvation to all, and that's super important because what we're going to be looking at today is the substance of the gospel, the scope of the gospel, and the simplicity of the gospel, okay? The simplicity of the gospel is how we're going to be ending this today. But let's start with the substance of the gospel. Romans 10:13 reads, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." The substance of the gospel is that it offers salvation. And salvation is just basically a big word for being saved. But being saved from what? Well, the first is we're being saved because of salvation. We are saved from the penalty of sin. And what that means is that the penalty of sin, or the wages of sin, is death. And when it says that in Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death, what it's saying is that what we have earned for disobeying God and doing things that aren't righteous or missing the mark in a way, what happens is that what we earn from that is eternal separation from God. We have tainted a relationship with God. But salvation restores that. It continues on in 6:23 to say, but the gift of Christ is eternal life. He saves us from the penalty of sin. We get to be with God for forever. And going from that, the presence of sin. We're saved from the presence of sin. Imagine being with God in eternity, and if nothing that isn't holy can be in the presence of God, then it makes sense that if we're in the presence of God, we cannot be in the presence of sin. Sin isn't holy, and it can't be in the presence of God. We're also saved from the power of sin. And what I mean by that is we're saved from being a slave to sin. And this is a really interesting point, because when you break down what a slave really is in the original language, what it's trying to communicate is you serve the will of the master. Okay, you serve the will of the master. So if you're a slave to sin, you are serving the will of your sin, or you're serving your desires. You're serving what you want, the utmost fulfillment is what you want, rather than when you become a slave or obeying God, then what happens is you are serving the will of God. No longer are you under the power or a slave to sin. And that's a beautiful thing. That is the substance of the gospel. The next is the scope of the gospel. Let's read it again. It says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." The scope or the range of salvation or the gospel is it's for everyone. It's for everyone. How awesome is it that our access to God, our opportunity to be restored and be in right relationship with God, is not discriminatory. We find in Revelation that every tribe, tongue, and nation is represented. That means that there is a representative who is following Christ at the end times of every tribe, tongue, and nation. That means it's not discriminatory based on the color of your skin or your origin or where you're from, your poverty line. It doesn't matter. The gospel is for everyone. It says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." And then the last point is that the simplicity of the gospel. So many times when we think of maybe sharing our faith, or we think of telling other people about Jesus, it gets really scary because we have these internal debates, or we have these theological thoughts of, I don't know every single answer. Now I want you to consider the time when Peter was getting off the boat and he was walking on the water, and Jesus was out there and he was saying, "Come to me." And Peter gets distracted. He starts seeing the storm, he starts seeing the crashing waves, and he starts getting scared. And what happens? He starts to sink. He starts to sink, and he cries out to Jesus, and he has a simple call. He says, "Save me, Lord. Save me, Lord." That's it. There was no theological debate or internal debate in his heart in that moment. It was just, "Lord, save me." And that's the simplicity of the gospel in its purest form, is that for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's beautiful. Because it doesn't mean that you have to have all the answers right. It doesn't mean that you have to have this theological framework that is without error or fault. But you have to believe in Jesus and call on his name to be saved. And that's a beautiful thing, because when you recognize your sin, you recognize that you're sinking in that water. The simplicity of the gospel is that all you have to do is call on the name of the Lord and you'll be saved. And he is faithful to answer that call. Earlier we talked about how in this time we are really considering maybe the things that are going on the inside, because we don't have all the distractions or the events or the things going on to keep our mind off of those things. And today we've talked about the substance of the gospel, the scope of the gospel, and the simplicity of the gospel. And the point is, if you desire a relationship with God, all you have to do is believe and ask the Lord to save you from your sin. That's it. It's not some crazy answer that you have to find out, but it's just calling on the name of the Lord. And earlier we talked about all these distractions, and I want you to consider this idea of calling on the name of the Lord. And what is in a name? Well, I'll give you an example. Say I were to write you a check for $1 million. $1 million. Well, if you tried to cash that check for $1 million, it probably would bounce, because I don't have $1 million. But what if Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, or Warren Buffett wrote you a check for $1 million? the exact identical check, what if those guys wrote to you? Well, you'd get a much different result. The only difference was in a name. God only honors for salvation the name of his Son. Christians have salvation through Christ alone. It doesn't matter what has happened, it doesn't matter what you've done, and it doesn't matter what's been done to you. Christ can wash you white as snow. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Excited to see you guys next week on another episode of Going Viral, Christianity in Quarantine.